So I want to take a look at what is Murica and which states are the most Murican. Now, when I define Murica, like Murica is basically a phrase making fun of Americans, like Murica, fuck yeah. And it doesn't describe all Americans, nor does it describe the entire country. I think what it really describes is a certain type of culture that is based on excessive individualism, excessive materialism, car culture. Generally, it often correlates with red states and voting Republican, but not always, because I find there are some blue or purple regions that are very, very American. It often correlates with valuing things that are very flashy and tacky, like, say, big trucks, big cars, like big SUVs, just really flashy shit. Like Las Vegas is a perfect example. Like everything about Vegas is extremely American. From the casino towers to the showgirls. Like, it's just all about things that are just very over the top, but in a tacky way. And as I've said, like, there are places that are quite American that aren't in America. Like, I think Dubai is very American, and those Persian Gulf countries can be very much that way in general. Same with some parts of Canada. Like, I'd say Alberta, Saskatchewan can be very American. Australia, even like Queensland, Australia. Like, I've never been to Australia, but from what I've heard of it, it sounds like parts of Australia can be pretty American. And it's also not something that's necessarily an exclusively white thing. It does correlate with redneck culture, but I wouldn't say it 100% correlates with it. Like, I think there's plenty of people who aren't rednecks, like, who don't have a southern accent, who aren't white, and who don't listen to country music, but nonetheless possess these traits. I would say certain genres of music are correlated with Murica. Like, I would say country is, rap is, certain types of rock and roll, like hard rock, like maybe like glam rock or whatever, but definitely not all types of like metal music. Like some types of metal music maybe, but like a lot of metal definitely not. Um yeah, I would say, oh, country rap hybrids are like the most American music possible. So when you have like Kid Rock, for instance, he would be like the epitome of Americanism. But yeah, when looking at what Muricanism is, I think we really need to ask where are the most American places. So I'm actually ranking all the states from least American to most. So I'm gonna rank them all, and I'm gonna briefly say my rationale behind each of them. So the very last are the territories like Puerto Rico and Guam. Those aren't even real states. They're not American at all. They're culturally not very American, and they're kind of like third world. And yeah, I mean, Americanism, as I said, isn't necessarily white, but it is something that correlates with having money, because you need money to be that materialistic. And these places just aren't wealthy enough to have that culture, really. So yeah, they're the least, and they're not even really part of America. 51 is Hawaii. Now, Hawaii is somewhat wealthier, but I find their culture isn't like, it's so different from the rest of America, and they just don't seem to have that like they're a very blue state. And like, I've never been to Hawaii, but to my understanding, they seem to be obsessed with environmental preservation to the extent they just close hiking trails and don't let people go on them. And I remember during the big event of 2020, 2021, they were like the most restrictive state, which goes very much against the American idealism of like freedom and individualism. Yeah, the broken clock was right that time. I get it. But yeah, Hawaii just doesn't seem to embody Americanism at all. So yeah, I'm putting them at the bottom of the list. Number 50, ironically, is District of Columbia. Americanism inherently hates density, walkability, and public transit, and it hates historic architecture. And DC has all these things. So yeah, ironically, despite being the nation's capital and despite having so many important monuments to the nation of the United States, DC is an extremely un-American place. So yeah, it's number 50. 49 is Massachusetts. Again, it's a very blue state. Boston's a very historic city by, has a lot of historic architecture, public transit, and walkability. It's not a very it's not a state that lends itself to the American culture one bit. So yeah, I'm putting them near the bottom of the list. Next is Vermont. I put them slightly higher than Massachusetts because they're more rural, and that's another thing. Like Muricanism definitely correlates with either being rural or suburban. The only exception is if you have a city that feels like kind of like an adult theme park, like Las Vegas or Dubai. As I said, like Dubai is a non-American American city, or a literal theme park, like in the case of Orlando. But despite that, yeah, being rural or suburban as opposed to urban does correlate with being more American. So for that reason, I put Vermont as slightly higher than Massachusetts, but nonetheless, they might actually be lower than Massachusetts in other regards because they're just extremely liberal. Um, they just they're not big fans of the like fuck yeah libertarian mentality. Like they tend to be like higher taxes, more liberal. So yeah, Vermont is very close to the bottom of the list at 48. 47 is Connecticut. Again, like all of New England is kind of clustering here, so I don't know how much detail I need to go into about each one. Yeah, Connecticut for similar reasons. 46, Rhode Island for similar reasons, but I will say they vote slightly less overwhelmingly Democrat than some of the others here. So I'm gonna put them slightly higher on the list than the ones already. 45 would be Washington State. Now, Washington is interesting because there's most of the part where most people live is very, very un-American, which is west of the Cascade Mountains, like Seattle in particular, very like left-leaning, aggressively so in some ways. Like they had the whole autonomous Antifa zone. But at the same time, when you get into the eastern part of the state, you do actually get into like cowboy country. So for that reason, Washington's a bit higher than the others mentioned so far on the list, but still overall very, in terms of where people actually live for the most part, it's very un-American. 44 Oregon, basically same exact thing as Washington. I'm not sure which of the two is technically, they're both very close. They could almost be ranked as exactly the same because they kind of are exactly the same. So yeah. Next on the list is Delaware. I'd say, as with many northeastern states, they're overwhelmingly Democrat, and they don't have that American culture as much. I just don't have a lot to say about Delaware in this regard. I think I put them in about the right place. 42 is Alaska. Now, Alaska is bizarre on this list because it is quite Republican and it has a lot of the traits associated with America, like the gun culture, the more rural kind of culture. Although a lot of them do live in Anchorage, that's true. But Anchorage isn't exactly a super walkable city. But why I put Alaska lower on the list is I find the Murica culture is very much associated in some ways with hot weather and warm weather. And Alaska is the exact opposite of that. So they are right wing, but I don't think they're very right wing in American kind of way. Like Alaska is not all about like flashy materialism and stuff like that. Like I don't get that vibe with them. I mean, yeah, okay, they do probably drive a lot of SUVs and stuff, but like at the same time, like they don't seem to be all about that bling bling. Like I do think that's the thing about Muricanism. Like it has a white aspect, but it also has a black aspect to it. Like the whole bling bling culture. I think is a very American thing. And yeah, Alaska just doesn't seem to be like that at all. It doesn't seem to be the kind of place for people who want to live that lifestyle to go. I mean, it's the kind of place where you have to like bundle up so like women can't even like dress like provocatively hardly any of the year at all in Alaska. So, I mean, yeah, Alaska's just not that high on the list. Like it really in some ways is more similar to like some of the parts of many parts of northern Canada. So, yeah, number 41 would be New Jersey. Um New Jersey has some American traits like with the whole Jersey Shore culture. It's very tacky, very materialistic, but nonetheless, it is a predominantly blue state. It is a state that's near some of the most walkable cities and has areas that are walkable themselves, like many parts of the New York metropolitan area on the Jersey side, like Hoboken and places like that. And there's a lot of public transit and stuff. And it's like they even said on The Sopranos, like Elvis country. It's where there's no Jews or Italians, you know? So it's like, yeah, New Jersey is not Elvis country, and Elvis country is very much America. So I'm going to say New Jersey has some American traits, but overall it's just not that high on the America scale. So number 40 is New York. Now, New York City would be at the extreme bottom of this list, but I will say other parts of New York State, you do get a bit more of the American culture. Like when you go upstate, you get more of that like Rust Belt, almost Midwestern kind of vibe. And that is significantly more American. But because New York City is, I believe, the vast majority of New York State's population, like in the New York City metropolitan area, not to mention the most important part politically and culturally, I'm going to have to put New York pretty low on the list, despite the fact that it does get kind of American in some areas as you get upstate. I would say probably especially outside the major cities upstate. Like, some of the backcountry does get kind of American, but yeah. Number 39 is Maryland. Now, I think Maryland, again, the urban parts are very un-American, like Baltimore and the DC suburbs. But as you get into like the Maryland panhandle, the western part of the state, it gets way more American out there. But overall, the parts of the state that have the most cultural influence are more Boswash, kind of like walkable cities and very Democrat leaning and lots of public transit. Some historic towns outside of Baltimore, also like Annapolis. So yeah, I mean, I'd say Maryland is not terribly American, but there are some American parts. Number 38 is Maine. Maine is difficult to categorize here because, again, like some parts are very un-American, like Portland, but as you get into the more rural areas, I think it does get a bit more American, but still not hyper-American because it's still kind of like it gets more Republican, but it doesn't get like hyper-Republican. So yeah, I'd put Maine there. It's more rural than the other New England states, less dark blue than most of the other New England states, but still, I'd say fairly un-American. Number 37 is Minnesota. Now Minnesotans I've often called crypto Canucks because they talk like Canadians. They have a similar accent, similar mannerisms. I think they even say a lot of the time, and they're the most polite state in the U.S. So just being, and also there's a lot of them are Scandinavian backgrounds. So being both crypto Scandies and crypto Canucks automatically makes them lower on the Americanism scale. However, I will say, some parts of Minnesota, like the fact that a significant portion of Minnesota is in the Great Plains region, which is just the flat farmer country, like that area is hyper-American. So it's like the fact that Minnesota borders on a lot of hyper-American states and maybe has parts of that within its state, I don't know. I don't know where exactly to put them on the list. They're not terribly high. They're pretty low on the list, but yeah, and they're also a blue state, so there is that. 36 would be Wisconsin. Wisconsin is, to my understanding, a bit similar to Minnesota in some ways, but not actually, probably not. I don't think they have the accent really there. I've been to Wisconsin a few times. They didn't seem to have that accent, but then again, I wouldn't notice because I'm fucking Canadian. Because that is my accent. To me, that would be like a normal. Oh, that's not true. I do notice thick Canadian accents, but yeah. I don't know. Wisconsin, I would have thought of them as less American, but the fact that they've started becoming more of a Republican state and they've started, I don't know. I guess I put them as slightly more American than Minnesota, but not terribly. They're still on the lower part of this list. Number 35 is New Mexico. To be honest, this is what I have on the list. I'm starting to think they should be lower. I don't know. Like New Mexico, they're a weird state because they sort of have this cowboy culture, which is very American, but they also have more strongly this like Hispanic culture. That's one thing I didn't get in Breaking Bad. Why is it that like when Hank went to El Paso, he was like a fish out of water because he couldn't speak Spanish? But it's like, hey, you're from Albuquerque. Isn't Albuquerque like almost as Hispanic as El Paso? I guess maybe slightly less, but I don't know. I've always gotten the vibe that like New Mexico has a very strong Hispanic culture, and Hispanic culture is kind of American. Like it can overlap with American culture, but I would say American culture comes more from like rednecks and blacks than it does from Hispanics. And it comes a bit from like baller types too, like, you know, like just flashy capitalist libertarian types like crypto bros and whatever. Yeah, I would say New Mexico, it's probably not terribly high on the list, so I have it at 35. 34 is California. Now, California is interesting because it has been many places the birthplace of Americanism. Like the whole idea of suburbia and the American dream was largely, it wasn't technically born in California because the first suburb was Levittown on Long Island, but like the first modern style American suburb. But nonetheless, California was where that kind of culture really took off, and it became seen as synonymous with the so-called American dream. So California, again, very synonymous with like freeway culture, car culture, which are very American things. And a lot of these things came from California. California was really popularized them and really made a big deal out of them in the first place. But California has changed a lot over the years. It's become a lot more liberal, a lot more Democrat, but nonetheless, in spite of their intentions, like they haven't, like intercity rail in California still sucks. There's only like one train a day between LA and San Francisco in each direction. They haven't been able to get high-speed rail off the ground at all. It's been a complete failure. So the fact that like they're trying to be more like transit-oriented but failing so much proves to me that there's still an element of Muricanism in California. Like they're trying, but they're failing because in spite of their best efforts, the fact is California was built on Muricanism and Murican culture, and in spite of their best efforts to overcome that, they still have just too much Murica in their cultural DNA to effectively overcome it. So I'm putting California there. It's lower than average, but I think it still actually does have some strong Murican traits, more so than a lot of the states earlier on. Like I would say the only place in California that's like extremely un-Murican is San Francisco. And even then, I'd only say the city of San Francisco. I'd say once you get to other parts of the Bay Area, it does get more Murican. So, I mean, although you could say that even for the suburbs of New York or Boston, granted, or Philadelphia or DC. But yeah, I would say California's low on the list, but not terribly low. Number 33 is New Hampshire. New Hampshire is an interesting case. It's a bizarre anomaly because it's Democrat, but it's also kind of libertarian. In some ways, very libertarian. They have some of the lowest taxes in the entire U.S. They're not exactly like rednecks or anything, but they are libertarians. It's a weird like left libertarian kind of vibe, and I guess they're kind of Murican, but not terribly. So that's why I'm putting them there on the list. They're very hard to categorize in that regard. They don't seem to be like They seem to be very orderly though. Like they have a very low crime rate, just like Maine and Vermont, and that would make them less American because I think one characteristic of Americanism is some degree of disorderliness, like that comes along with this whole like ma freedom culture. And I think a place with like a really low crime rate like that is too inherently orderly to be terribly high on the Americanism scale. So yeah, that's why New Hampshire gets number 33. 32 is Colorado. Colorado is interesting in this regard because in some ways it's very un-American. Like it has the lowest obesity rate in the United States, which is very un-American. Being obese is very American, as in all the memes, like the Spurdo Sparday or however you call it, those memes with the cheeseburgers. But nonetheless, okay, Colorado. I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's liberal in some ways, but like having been to Colorado several times recently, it does feel rather American in the sense there's a lot of sprawling suburbs. Um, there's it is very car centric. Like public transit hasn't taken off that much there, aside from a little bit of light rail in the Denver area. But like, I don't know. I mean, Colorado, it's in between. I'll say that it's in between overall. 31 is Pennsylvania. Now, Pennsylvania is interesting because Philadelphia is extremely un-American for the same reasons as like DC, New York, and Boston and Baltimore. But at the same time, other parts of Pennsylvania are very American, which is why they've actually have voted for Trump, and they have enacted some fairly anti-abortion laws. So they're an odd state in that regard because I think there's a lot of diversity in that sense. Like the most American regions are quite American, like the rural Appalachian parts, but the least American regions are less so. Not just Pennsylvania, not just Philadelphia, but some of the other historic walkable cities and towns in the Southeast, which I've talked a lot about in my other videos, like places like Harrisburg and Lancaster and other cities and towns like that. But as you go further west and in Pennsylvania, I think it gets a lot more American as you get further into Appalachia, further away from Philadelphia. So yeah, that's kind of where they are on the list. Lower than average, but some parts are very American. Number 30 is Illinois, and similar to Pennsylvania. But actually in Illinois' case, I would say the contrast is even stronger because it's straight up just like Chicago versus the rest of the state. That's pretty much how Illinois is. The only exceptions is, okay, there might be like, okay, with like East St. Louis, maybe like the east suburbs of St. Louis, not just the terrible literal city of East St. Louis, which is one of the worst shitholes in the United States, but there's also other suburbs of St. Louis on the eastern side. So, yeah, I mean, other than those two metropolitan areas, I'd say Illinois is quite American, quite Midwestern, quite Rust Belt. But Chicago, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think, that I'm definitely not wrong. Like the Chicago metropolitan area is by far the majority of the population in Illinois, and they have by far the most political and cultural influence. So yeah, that fact in and of itself puts Illinois on the lower half of this list. They're less American than most states, despite the fact that once you get out of Chicago, for the most part, it's very, very American, very Midwestern. And again, the Midwest as a whole, like outside the big cities, it's very American because there's a lot of this like kind of like suburban soccer mom kind of culture. Like Americanism is weird in that regard because it can be puritanical in some ways, but it can also be hedonistic in other ways. It can take on both forms. And I would say the Midwest shows more like the puritanical side of American culture. Like there's a lot of like the whole Karen archetype is very strongly associated with the Midwest. Like people who complain when there's like a boob in a PG-13 movie. But like, for instance, Nevada would be like the opposite of that because it's very American, like Vegas, but it's very hedonistic. So again, it can manifest itself in both ways. But yeah, that's where I'd put Illinois on the list. 29 is Louisiana. Louisiana is another outlier state, kind of like New Hampshire, where it's a conundrum. It's not just about different parts of the state. It's that the state entire, like large, well, I'd say like half of the state is just a straight up conundrum in this regard. Like I would say northern Louisiana is very much just straight up America. Like it's southern, it's redneck. Yeah. But and the black parts are like, like I don't exactly know what the black culture is like in the Mississippi Delta. Is it like bling bling culture? Is it like black redneck culture? I'm not sure, but I would guess it's probably fairly American in that regard. Um, what I would say is less American though in Louisiana is the southern part of the state because you get that infusion of French culture, the Cajun and Creole culture, and especially in New Orleans. Like I'd say New Orleans is an extremely un-American city. In some ways it even feels like being in Europe, like being in Southern Europe. And that is very, very un-American. Like the architecture, the walkability, just the way everything looks. Like I'd say it's the most architecturally European city in the US. And in some ways, the most culturally. There's some very culturally European things about New Orleans. Like the fact that like there's pickpockets there. Pickpockets aren't usually a thing in the US, but they have pickpockets just like Europe. And scammers just like Europe who try to scam you on shit. So yeah, for better and for worse, New Orleans feels like it is America's most European city in many ways, and definitely most Southern European. It has that vibe strongly. So yeah, because of that, I can't put Louisiana higher on the list because New Orleans is very un-American, and even other parts of southern Louisiana are kind of un-American, although less so, because they do have that French cultural influence, even if most of them don't speak French. And even if it is a dark red state, Louisiana just has certain traits like Mardi Gras, for instance. Like I would say Mardi Gras is un-American because it feels in some ways like it has more in common with like it's not tacky. I'll say that. Like it feels like it's like in some ways it feels actually like an authentic cultural festival, just like Carnival in Brazil or the Winter Carnival in Quebec City. Like it doesn't feel like just some fake ass tacky corporatized shit. Like it feels like an actual authentic cultural festival in the same way a lot of the festivals there do. That's another thing. Like this emphasis on festivals, it's more community oriented, whereas Muricanism, everything tends to be more privatized. Like they kind of dislike a lot of like public festivals, and they like just more like private events and private parties and things like that. Like that's why, as I say, Vegas is quite Murican because it's very private. Like everything takes place within like a specific casino and not in like public space, like the events there. So that's what I mean. Like Louisiana is less American in that regard, in the sense there's like this emphasis on like public festivals, public carnivals, in public spaces, which is again more European, more Southern Europeans especially, but even Northern Europe, like they have like Oktoberfest, which I think it's a more public type thing. I don't know if it technically takes place on private property, but it's presented as more like a public event. Let me put it that way. So yeah, Louisiana for that reason would be below average for Americanism. Number 28 is Virginia. Virginia, again, kind of like with Illinois and Pennsylvania, it depends a lot where you are in the state because the DC suburbs are very un-American, especially Alexandria, which is a well-preserved historic old town, very walkable. Richmond, to my understanding, is not a terribly American city. Somewhat historic, although again, they removed those statues, which is really shitty of them, but not a terribly American city. But I do think Virginia gets a lot more American when you get into the rural areas, and especially the western part of the state. So yeah, I'd say Virginia, it's not a terribly American state overall, but it has some very American parts. But I would say the balance is a bit like in Illinois, Chicago is the majority of the state. And in Pennsylvania, I think Philadelphia plus Pittsburgh, and some of the other walkable cities. I'm not sure. Pittsburgh isn't terribly walkable. Well, some parts of it I think are. but some parts are historic and walkable. But my point is like, okay, in Virginia, I'm not sure how much of a percentage of the state the less American parts are, but nonetheless, there is that contrast. Number 27 is Utah. Utah is very difficult, another outlier state, another state that's very difficult to categorize because in some ways Mormons are the epitome of Muricanism. Like they literally believe in this like addition to the Bible that makes like America the new Israel, which is an extremely Murican thing to believe. Like this idea that like America is some sort of holy land, like it has some sort of like religious biblical significance, like Jesus was an American, you know, like this very American kind of thing to believe. But some of the culture practices of Mormons are very un-American in the sense they're very orderly people. Like they believe in keeping things very clean and orderly, so they're not like all about freedom necessarily. Like they're like Utah seems like a society that's like they have a very low crime rate and they seem more orderly. So that aspect makes them a bit less American because there's less of that like freedom culture compared to some of the more American places. So, I mean, Mormonism is very restrictive in many regards. It's definitely not all about personal freedom, that's for sure. So yeah, they're kind of middle of the road for that reason. They're an oddity. And yeah. So number 26 would be Michigan. Michigan's hard to categorize. I'd say they're moderately American because they have that whole like Eminem white trash culture going, which I think is pretty American. But they're maybe a bit less hyper American because they're not a dark red state. And like I don't know, they're kind of like they're not like hyper flashy because Michigan's not like the wealthiest state ever also, so there is that. There's a good deal of poverty there, but nonetheless I think they're middle of the road. So yeah, number 25 is Idaho. A lot of Mormons but not quite as many as Utah. There is that cowboy culture, I think, a bit more there. I mean, Utah has the cowboy culture, but it's all filtered through the kind of squeaky clean Mormon lens. Idaho, it's like that, but maybe a bit less so. So it's a bit more American, but not that much more. So yeah, 25 is Idaho. 24, North Dakota. A pretty like it's very rural. Very Republican, but I think they do have a little bit of that like crypto Canuck thing going on, kind of like Minnesotans do. I don't know. Do they? I don't actually know. I've never been to North Dakota. So I'm putting them as middle of the road. 23 is Montana. Here we're starting to get in, like, again, like in the last few, we're starting to get into like the very American states. Like I would say this upper half of the list is all very American. So Montana, yeah, very strong cowboy culture, like in the show Yellowstone, which is obviously not a realistic show, but it does depict the fact that like the cowboy culture, like that aspect is not unrealistic. The cowboy culture, what's unrealistic is the sheer amount of violence and murder that takes place in that show. But yeah, the cowboy culture is definitely a strong thing in Montana. So it is very American for that reason, very rural. One thing that's a bit less American about it is the sheer amount of land that's owned by the federal government. A lot of Americans don't like that, but nonetheless, Montana is still pretty high on the list. But Montana is pretty cold, and that makes them a bit lower because I do find, as I said before, there is a bit of a correlation between Muricanism and valuing hot weather, like really liking this whole like Sunbelt kind of like fun in the sun kind of mentality. So that places Montana a bit lower because it's not as hot as some of the other states on the list. Well, it's fairly sunny, but not terribly hot. 22 is Wyoming, similar to Montana, but slightly further south. So that's why I put Wyoming slightly higher, because it's slightly warmer. Actually, I'm not sure because there's a lot of mountainous elevated regions, but whatever. Similar to Montana. 21, North Carolina. It definitely has that southern redneck culture, but it also has a lot of these like northern transplants. So like it's a mostly red state. It kind of has that Murica vibe. I'd say pretty strongly for the most part, but it does have like kind of like colonies of like northern liberals like around Duke University. I don't know if it's mostly northern liberals or just southern liberals, but yeah, it's pretty American for the most part, but it has pockets that are a bit less American perhaps. So yeah. Number 20 is Ohio, the state that is seen as average in every way. It's pretty American, pretty suburbanized, car dependent. They don't even have rail service between Columbus, Cincinnati, and Cleveland, which is embarrassing, like passenger rail. But on a neighborhood level, there are some neighborhoods within the cities that don't feel that American. Like there is a few that have some historic architecture and walkability, although not a lot, but still a few neighborhoods lingering that are like that. Plus Cleveland has a pretty good art museum. So that's those things are un-American, but as a whole, Ohio is a very American state. Like there's a reason why there's all the memes about Ohio representing the average of America and being the most American state, but I don't think it's the most American. It might be the most average in some ways, but it's not the most American because being the most American requires being different from the average because the average in America is being moderately American, whereas being hyper American can make you actually a bit of an outlier. So that's why Ohio is number 20. Georgia. Number 19 because the Atlanta's a very American city despite being Democrat. It's very car dependent, very sprawled. It's I think like the most sprawled, it might be the most sprawled city in the United States. It's ridiculous the sheer amount of suburban sprawl that exists there. The state as a whole is quite American, and again, as I say, black culture is not inherently un-American. So the black culture that exists in Atlanta can be in its own way a reflection of Americanism, like the bling bling and all that shit. The one thing that stops Georgia from being higher on the list is the fact that the city of Savannah exists. And Savannah, you got Atlanta and Savannah is the very un-American one because it's very historic and walkable. So yeah, Savannah being in Georgia prevents it from being higher on this list, but otherwise it's a very American state. Number 18, South Carolina, exact same as Georgia, but with Charleston instead of Savannah being the outlier exception city that's historic and walkable and un-American, but it's a very American state otherwise. 17 is Arizona. Now the urban areas in Arizona are quite American, like a lot of suburban sprawl in Phoenix and Tucson. The one thing that makes it like there's also like to my understanding in Arizona, they're all about like strict law enforcement. Like they have a reputation for having very, very harsh police there. I've been to Arizona a few times and I've actually never ran into cops directly in the US at all, except for one parking ticket when I wasn't there, which was in Massachusetts. I came back to the car and had a parking ticket. But yeah, Arizona does have a reputation for that, like Sheriff Joe Arpaio and all that, like being like excessively tough on crime. And I think that Simon Says video that was from Arizona, that horrendous video where the cop murdered that guy. But yeah, Arizona does have those very American traits, but it also has a lot of like federally owned land, like national parks and stuff, which is something that Americans bitch about. So yeah, Arizona is very American in a lot of ways, but and Sedona is definitely an exception because it has that kind of hippie culture. But again, it's definitely not reflective of Arizona as a whole. So I'd say Arizona is a pretty American state. It's not the most, but pretty American overall. Number 16, Indiana. It's a bit like Ohio, but more Republican, and they've have some very strict anti-abortion laws now. So I guess they're getting very American in the sense of being very Republican. I mean, I'm not saying being anti-abortion it inherently makes you American. There are some people who are very anti-abortion in Eastern Europe who aren't American at all. I'm just saying that, like, being a dark red state is indicative of being like there is a correlation. So yeah, it's not just that though. It's like very very Midwestern, very Rust Belt, and it doesn't really have much walkability or urbanism to speak of. Like Indianapolis, it's like downtown Indianapolis is just like a sea of parking lots basically, and high rises without that much like skyscrapers. I mean, without that much walkability to speak of or street life to speak of. So yeah, Indiana as a whole I think is a very American state. Number 15 is South Dakota. Again, like very American overall. But I think the reason I have it as more than North Dakota is because, to my understanding, North Dakota does have a little bit of that like crypto Canuck vibe. I don't know if they do actually. Is that just Minnesota? I'm not sure. Like, because there's the show Fargo, but that's set in Minnesota. I don't even, and the movie too. I don't even know. You know what? Maybe North Dakota deserves to be higher on the list than I put it, because I'm thinking like, why did I put South Dakota so much higher than North Dakota? Does that make sense? Maybe not. It's fair enough. So maybe North Dakota deserves to be around here on the list also. But yeah, South Dakota, I mean, Mount Rushmore, I like Mount Rushmore, but Mount Rushmore is kind of American in a way. Like, I think carving the president's faces onto a mountain is a very American thing to do. But I'll say I wouldn't call it tacky, because I think it's genuinely beautiful and it's a great work of art. And something being a great work of art automatically makes it less tacky. So I guess, like, I mean, Mount Rushmore, it feels kind of American, but at least it feels like a higher quality of Americanism. I'll say that. I don't oppose Mount Rushmore. I support its existence. I am against the people who want to dynamite it. I've been there. It's a cool spot to see for sure. But yeah, South Dakota overall, like when I was there, I did get a vibe. It seemed very American, like a lot of billboards and stuff like that. The kinds of billboards you see in America, like, yeah, the meme where it's like the anti-abortion billboard followed by the billboard for like the sex shop or like something like that. That meme is very accurate for that entire American culture. So yeah, I put South Dakota there. 14, Missouri. Don't got a lot to say about Missouri. Never been there, but it seems very American. St. Louis didn't preserve much in terms of walkability, like maybe one or two neighborhoods. They paved it over and put up a parking lot. I don't know. Missouri seems like a very American state to me. Even more so than Ohio, I would say. A bit more redneck than Ohio, because you got the Ozarks and everything. So yeah, I'd say as a whole, and then St. Louis is like the kind of like black city that used to be walkable, but they paved it all over and put up parking lots and freeways, and now it's hideous. So yeah, I'd say Missouri is pretty American. 13 is West Virginia. West Virginia, it's very redneck. It's one of the most redneck places in the US, but the fact that they're poor makes them a bit less American than some of the higher ones on the list. West Virginia is very much like the poor underbelly of America. High obesity, low rates of like passport ownership, very car dependent. But at the same time, the fact that they're poor prevents them from having the excesses of some of the states higher on the list. So that's why I put them there. Kentucky, number 12, similar to West Virginia, but I guess slightly less poor. So that's why I put them slightly higher on the list. Louisville has like a couple neighborhoods that are kind of walkable and historic, but overall, I'd say Kentucky is a very American state. 11, Arkansas. Never been there, don't have a lot to say about it. It's just very deep south kind of redneck kind of vibes. 10, Mississippi. Possibly some people would put this as number 1. I don't think so, because the fact that they're kind of poor would put them as lower on the list than some of the higher ones. But yes, it's a very redneck state, very like Republican leaning, very unwalkable, car oriented. And yeah, I know there's the whole meme of Mississippi being last in the country in so many metrics. Some of those metrics, most of those metrics, I'd say make them more American, but being poor might make them less because, again, part of Americanism is excess. And in order to be excessive, you need to have money. So that's why I wouldn't put Mississippi right at the top of the list. Number nine, Alabama, similar to Mississippi, but maybe slightly less poor. So yeah. Number eight, Tennessee. Now, Tennessee, what makes it very American is that it's the seat of like country music culture. And I think that in and of itself makes it extremely American. You have Nashville, which is like the mecca for country music. And you have Memphis, which is sort of like a crime-ridden shithole. So yeah, I mean, kind of like the Detroit of the South. But yeah, basically, I don't know. Tennessee, not very walkable. It's very car oriented. Both those cities and the state in general. So yeah, I'd say it's a very American state. Tennessee is. We're starting to get into like the extremely American states, and I would say Tennessee qualifies as extremely American. Number seven is Florida. Now, there's the whole meme of Florida man. And I think Florida is a place that wears its tackiness on its sleeve. Like, it's proud of how fake it is. Like, there's the theme parks, and there's also just the entire culture of excess. Like, Florida has one of the strongest cultures of excess in the entire country. I might put it as the second or third most excessive state in the entire country. Like, it's very much about flaunting wealth in a tacky and excessive way. Like McMansions, like mega McMansions and shit like that. What prevents Florida from being number one, though, is the fact that it does have some parts of the state that are heavily Hispanic, that are not really fully integrated into the American culture, like some parts of Miami. Also, the town of St. Augustine is quite historic and un-American. But overall, yeah, Florida is very tacky, very flashy, very in your face about it. So yeah, I think it does qualify as being an extremely American state. Number six is Nevada. Now, what struck me about Nevada when I was there, there's so many billboards and stuff for places. Like, there's ads everywhere for places where it's like, fire a machine gun, fire any kind of gun, like a mini gun, whatever. Like, you can come here, pay for it, and fucking fire any weapon you want, blow shit up. And it's like, to me, like, Nevada's like the epitome of like libertarianism. Like Vegas itself, with the relaxed laws on everything from gambling to prostitution, just the sheer tackiness of Vegas, like these mega casino towers in the middle of the desert. Like, Nevada's an extremely American place. In some ways, the most American, but why I have it as number six and not number one is that a lot of the land is federally owned, and some Americans really don't like that. So yeah, because there's so many national parks and just like military bases and stuff. But yeah, Nevada is in some ways the epitome. Like, parts of it are the epitome of Americanism, like Vegas and Reno, especially Vegas. But yeah, it's extremely American overall. Number five, Iowa. Not much to say about Iowa. It's flat, it's boring, it's flyover country. It has the world's largest truck stop, which is an extremely American thing to have. Yeah, this is just straight up America. Like, you're not even gonna find pockets of like un-American places in Iowa. It's just straight up Iowa is Iowa. Actually, wait, that's not true. There might be like, I think there's one college town that might be slightly un-American, but yeah. Overall, Iowa is just fucking America. Like, it's middle America. It's the epitome of middle America. Not really much more I can say about than that. Number four, Nebraska, basically same as Iowa, but I'd say even darker red. Because Iowa was a blue state up until a few elections ago, but they were kind of like blue dog Democrats. And now they're just straight up Republicans. But yeah, Nebraska is similar to Iowa, but even more Republican and just as flat and boring. So yeah, Nebraska, epitome of middle America. Number three, Texas. Now Texas in some ways is more American than America. Like, they're so American that they don't identify as American. They identify as Texan, and they want to separate. But nonetheless, like the entire phrase, everything's bigger than in Texas, I think that says a lot about their mentality. They're all about excess, extravagance, and they are quite wealthy. So they are quite over the top in how they express it. Like huge, the biggest trucks, the biggest SUVs, the biggest McMansions, the biggest freeways, the biggest fucking burgers, the biggest bellies. Like, good gosh, Texas is just over the top in how much they flaunt it. I think the only thing that stops them from being number one is that they have these like heavily Hispanic border regions that are a bit less. They're less American and more just straight up Mexican. So while most of Texas is the epitome of Muricanism, the fact that they have these regions that are the exception prevents it from being number one on the list. But yeah, Texas as a whole is extremely Murican. Number two is Oklahoma. Similar to Texas, but without the heavily Mexican border regions. So yeah, just a really over the top, kind of just in your face, Murican, very flat, boring place. Flat and boring, but also like everything's bigger, just like Texas. Number one is Kansas. So like Wizard of Oz, we're not in Kansas anymore. Like Kansas is the epitome of heartland America, as expressed in both Wizard of Oz and Superman. Like it's just the epitome of boring, flat heartland America. And I think isn't Kansas City also strongly associated with the country music scene? I think so, though not as much as Nashville. But yeah, overall, Kansas is just the epitome of it. Like it's just straight up middle America. And it wears it on its sleeve very proudly. So yeah, those are the least to most American states ranked overall. And by the way, if you were going to rank Canadian provinces, I would definitely say Alberta and Saskatchewan would be at the top of the list. Then Manitoba. I don't know. Then would be, I guess, BC and Ontario. Then would be the Atlantic provinces. And then Quebec would be bottom of the list because they're fucking French. And that in and of itself would make them very un-American. I guess New Brunswick would be second last on the list because they have the significant French minority. But yeah. So those are the least to most American states ranked overall.